Hello! Time for the last blog, Chapter 4 and 5 for Education in the U.S. Where does time go? Semester's already over. This is our last blog. That does not seem right. Okay. But this blog is going to be addressing diversity in the classroom, which came about in Chapters 4 and 5. The first thing that I started discussing was the socioeconomic impact that is present in education. Clearly, when people are of different socioeconomic levels, meaning some people are in richer environments, some people are in less well-off environments, like towns, whatever, the schooling is going to be impacted. I didn't exactly realize this because I just figured all schools were the same because of mandates and whatever. Obviously, that's not the case because the taxpayers' money is what goes into the classroom, and when as much money isn't present in certain towns as others, the education's going to suffer. I thought that was interesting. I never really thought about it. English language learners were another big part that was addressed in the diversity of the classroom. Clearly, when you have English language learners in your classroom, you have to cater to their needs. You need to be wary of what they're actually understanding, and you need to take your time teaching them. That was the biggest thing I took away from it. They are doing two things in their brains at once. They're trying to comprehend what I'm going to be teaching. They're going to try to be comprehending the algebra, the geometry that I'm teaching them, but at the same time, they're going to have to be searching for the words in their heads because English isn't their first language. And if they're not very great at English yet, Spanish is going to be what they think in. So hearing English is going to be a hardship for them. So it's really important to be sensitive to the students' needs in that regard. Another thing, the next thing that was brought up in the text, was gender in the classroom. This is another one. As far as diversity, I never thought of gender really being diverse. I just thought it was too overt, I guess. But gender does play a role in the classroom. In the past 10 years ago, females were typically performing below the levels of males. But that has made a quick turnaround because now females and males are equal in math and science, but what's interesting is in writing and reading, females are now a year to a year and a half ahead of the males. I thought that was completely interesting, and it kind of shows that like maybe more focus is being put on skills for males and the education for females, but either way, it needs to be equal. There definitely has to be more equality found within the education system, so everybody's granted the same rights and everybody's performing at the same level. So, I mean, I would have never been cognizant of that without reading that. So now going into a classroom, I know that I have to teach the males and the females in the same way, because I don't think it's fair to have the males performing at a level a year behind the females. Whereas it was not fair 10 years ago when females were basically not educated at the same level as males. So, I mean, it's going to be really important to keep that in the back of my mind, that the gender of my students doesn't matter. I need to treat everybody the exact same. I was going to do that anyway, but there are little stereotypes that sit in people's heads sometimes that make it more difficult to do that. Okay. Obviously, we're going to be moving on to what I think. I shouldn't say obviously, that's a little whatever. But the next thing I'm discussing is the race and cultural diversity. I feel like when people talk about diversity, race is the first thing that comes to everybody's mind. Obviously, you have black, white, Spanish. So be it, whatever. Right now, we're at a point in the country where white people are not going to be the majority in 10 years a couple years down the line. Everybody's going to be equal. There's not going to be any majority per se. So it's really time to start getting everybody educated at the same level. It's not fair to go into some districts and only teach white students properly because you're messed up in the head and think that that's correct. As a teacher, I'm going to make sure that no matter what color or race or culture my student has, they're going to be treated the same, no matter what. Because I found these numbers not alarming, but just interesting. The fact that 85.5% of white students will graduate. That's a pretty decent number. 74.4% of African Americans will graduate high school. That's over 10% difference. Why is that? And then even beneath the African Americans is only 73.7% of Latinos will graduate. In my opinion, something needs to be done about that. And I don't want to speculate, but if I had to guess, I think that the Latinos are probably the lowest because of what I had addressed before. What they're learning isn't going to come as easy to them because they have to be translating everything in their head. So teachers really, it just goes back to stress the importance of teachers emphasizing things and taking their time and making sure all students understand what they're talking about before they move on. Because I think that that can account for at least the Latino population not graduating. I mean, obviously not the whole thing, not the whole population, but I mean, it probably does have a substantial impact. Okay, next. School culture. It's not part of diversity per se, but it's just what diversity can do to the school, in my opinion, and how diversity can be reacted to in a school. The school culture is basically the way of life in the school. It's what goes on. It's what values teachers have, what values the administration has, what's expected from the students, what's expected from the teachers. That changes so drastically in every single school that you go to that it's impossible to categorize it as one way. And it's impossible to say that there's one right school culture. But reading this, there's one important thing that I think every school culture needs to embrace. And that is that all schools, I think, need to have culturally responsive teachers. Teachers need to be aware of the different cultures, the different races, the different everything going into their classroom. And when I say culture, I mean, obviously, we're talking about Black, white, and Spanish, but it's also important to not forget about the different socioeconomic students. It's in the gender. And then one other thing that I forgot to mention before was the sexuality. I would have never, ever thought about sexuality in the classroom because it really doesn't have any role. But clearly, as the book addressed, we need to be aware of that as teachers. We need to be aware that those gay, lesbian, bi, transgender students are being treated the same way as other students. Because, I mean, naive of me, it definitely does happen. And that's not right. Everybody needs to be educated at the same level. And then, last thing as far as, like, culturally, or the culture of the school, multicultural education, I think, needs to be part of it. Regardless of gender, sexuality, socioeconomic, race, and culture, students need to be taught the same level. And also, I think it's important to teach the different cultures. I think it's important to embrace different cultures within the school community so everybody knows a little bit about the cultures of everybody else. I think that's really important to have in the school culture. Okay, so now I'm going to make a little bit of a transition from a multicultural education to a free appropriate education. A free appropriate education is what is guaranteed to all students, but particularly through IDEA, the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, it's guaranteed to all students who have a special ed category, who are diagnosed with a disability that is under the IDEA's categorizations. In order to be categorized, you have to have some disability that hinders your academic performance. Through IDEA and what I said before, the Free Appropriate Public Education Act, you're guaranteed the least restrictive environment, meaning you're going to be, even though you have difficulties or disabilities, you're going to be in the least restrictive environment where you are with most general ed kids for what is most appropriate for you. You can't be held back being in all special ed classes when you don't belong there. That's really important for all teachers to realize. Just because a student has an IEP does not mean that they don't belong in general ed classes. There's so many different ways around that. There's collaboration. There's teachers. Collaboration is interesting. I want to bring up two possible ways of this. There's in-class support where teachers could collaborate. In-class support, when it's done right, is a great thing because you have two teachers in the room who are both there to genuinely help the students fulfill their potential. But in order to do that, the teachers really do need to plan together. They need to collaborate. They need to figure out what the two of them can do to help the students together. I feel like all too many times there is not enough collaboration with in-class support teachers. Also, when you have consulting teachers, itinerant teachers, speech-language therapists, OTs, PTs, it is so important for the general ed teacher to consult with them. Teachers need to know what they can do to help the students beyond what's being done in the pullout. That is a big thing I feel like a lot of teachers I've seen in my life don't do. There's a lack of communication. That communication needs to be so much stronger in order to really allow these students with disabilities to succeed to their highest potential. Because there are so many different resources out there that can be used. I mean, there's also the resource room, where there are students who need to be in the resource room most of the time because their disabilities are that hindering to their performance, which when they need that, that's completely appropriate, but they should not be placed in there because they have an IEP. And that's what the FAPE and the LRE guarantee, which I think those are two of the best laws in special education history. I don't want to ramble about special education too much because I could talk about it for days. It's something that I have a deep, deep interest in. But one other thing that is interesting with the whole education of special ed kids is over the past several years, assistive technology has really come a long way, and this assistive technology helps the students perform to their highest potential. And it's great because they can be so high-tech or they can be really low-tech. The biggest thing that's important with teaching the special ed kids is to provide them with what they need. Me, when I'm a teacher, I need to make sure that I provide each student, not just special ed students, all my students with what they need, but I need to definitely pay close attention to the special ed kids who are going to be in my classes, because you need to make sure they're in as many of the general ed classes as possible so they're not being restricted. You don't want to hold them back through an IEP. And sometimes I feel like students can be held back if teachers aren't innovative enough and pushing them enough and the communication isn't there. So that is so important. Now I'm going to make a little transition from special ed to the gifted and talented students. Gifted and talented students perform usually above their peers. They tend to get bored in classes. As a teacher, I need to know how to help them help themselves to learn more. Because I don't want anybody to be bored in my class because they know what I'm teaching. So enrichment, giving them extra things to do, finding real-life applications, accelerating what they're learning. Apprenticeship programs, where we pair them with somebody who's involved with what they're really interested in to help them. And mentoring. Mentoring is an important thing for them because these students can fall by the wayside sometimes. Sometimes because they are so focused on what their interest is, they'll forget about the long-term goal and they just focus on everything that they're interested in too much. And that can ultimately hurt their performance in some subjects. So I mean, the gifted and talented, it's definitely important to work with them as well. We can't forget about them. Just because they perform above their peers, they're just as important and just as vulnerable as anybody else. Okay, so last thing I'm going to hit on is at-risk students, meaning they have issues with substance abuse, teen pregnancy, they live in poverty, they were abused as a child, they're violent. There's so many tragedies that happen nowadays that you're going to encounter this in the classroom. It's just, as a teacher, you need to know the approach and how to help these students to the most potential. As a teacher, you need to help prevent these things from happening. When they do happen, if appropriate or if the situation presents itself, you need to deal with this intervention correctly. You need to reduce the effects of the risk factors. You need to make sure that everything goes as smoothly as possible. You need to help them transition. Transition isn't going to be easy for these students. As a teacher, you need to help them move on and work in either, whether it be graduate or get a job. You need, as a teacher, sometimes it's your role to help them see what they need to do. It's also important to think of new strategies. You really need to help these students overcome their risk, whether it be the pregnancy, whether it be drug use, whether it be child abuse. You need to help them overcome it. And that's really important. And then sometimes you need to compensate for the risk factors and what they're going through. As a teacher, you need to really focus on the good and the positive. And you need to make sure that their low income isn't being present in the classroom, because it shouldn't be ultimately. So, I mean, it's so important to realize their needs. I mean, I've talked about so many different things today. I've talked about race, I've talked about gender, I've talked about sexuality, special ed, at-risk students, gifted and talented students. No matter what, no matter how great a student is, you can't forget about them. You need to be aware of all the students in your classroom. You need to be aware of how you need to help every single one of your students in your classroom. That's what I took away from this chapter. It was a very meaningful chapter. I thought I learned a lot, and it opened my eyes to things that I need to be aware of when I'm a teacher. So, this is my last blog. I'm guessing I'll see you next semester with more blogs. Have a good one.